Hi everyone, I'm John Fenzel, and we're here at Section 53 of Arlington National Cemetery, where I'd like to introduce you to Frank Lillyman. Frank Lillyman was the first American paratrooper to drop behind enemy lines during the Normandy invasion in World War II with the 101st Airborne Division Pathfinders. An Army captain at the time of D-Day, he led a paratrooper unit into the hedgerows of France, and he stayed in Europe until the German surrender. Lilliman was born in Binghamton in 1915. He worked as a Cub newspaper reporter in that city at the Press and the Sun. He covered sports, high schools, and helped when needed on election nights. He joined the Army in 1934 as an infantryman in Hawaii and China. From 1937 through 1941, he worked as a recruiter in Syracuse. In 1942, with American involvement in World War II underway, Lilliman joined the paratroopers, a decision which had angered his father, who he described as an honest-to-goodness soldier of fortune. Frank told the Associated Press in 1944, "Dad didn't like it much when I went into the paratroops. He was an old horse cavalryman in the regular army." Frank trained at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was selected as a company commander in the newly formed 101st Airborne Division. He made 47 jumps before June 6, 1944, but D-Day would be his first one in combat. He'd do it with a cigar clenched between his teeth because that was his trademark. His men thought it brought him good luck. He said, "Paratroopers, like professional baseball players, acquire certain superstitions. With me, I've always stuck a cigar in my mouth when about to make a jump, and my men all know about it. They take it for good luck." And it was most of the time. "I swallowed the end of one once," he admitted. Whenever Lilliman ran low on cigars because the Army rationed them to 12 a week, he would write to his wife Jane back in Schenectady and ask her to send spares all the way from home. Lilliman explained to a reporter, "On my first jump, I happened to have cigars, so I've done it ever since. Now the boys attach a lot of importance to that cigar." He knew his men inside and out. Most weren't big on the rules and would have admitted to having had a close brush or two, or possibly three, with insubordination. His own regimental commander had called him an arrogant smartass behind his back before he'd gotten assigned to head up the Pathfinder training school. Frank was okay with that. He was proud of his team. In his opinion, a maverick disposition was almost an essential quality for its fighters. It went along with a strong sense of independence and was partly what would allow them to seize the initiative and make quick decisions under pressure. In short, it gave them the wherewithal to do their job knowing that they would sink or swim on their own. C-47 flew around the airfield for almost 2 hours. Then at about 11:30 in the evening, it finally stopped circling and began flying over the channel. Behind him in the troop section, Captain Lillyman looked down at the naval armada below. Destroyers, cruisers, troop carriers, battleships, gunships. They seemed to form a floating bridge that stretched on without end. You can practically imagine walking clear across France on their decks. One thing was obvious. The water was anything but calm. A strong wind was blowing over the wave tops, tossing the ships about in the chop. Depending on the variables like gusts and direction, Lilliman knew the wind could cause a whole slew of problems for the jump. If the men were dispersed over a wider area than expected, it could put them in a very, very dangerous situation. They didn't speak much throughout the 45-minute flight. They didn't say much. Any exchanges they did have were short and they were clipped. Smoking was barred once they were moving over the channel. The mood aboard that aircraft was very tense. Frank Lillyman's 101st Pathfinder team had departed England shortly before the 82nd Airborne teams. The Pathfinder Company's goal was to jump behind the enemy lines and mark the drop zones and the landing zones for the main waves of airborne troops to follow. 7 amber lights, placed in a T-shape and turned on when Lilliman gave the order, would indicate to the pilots when to turn on the green jump light. Others carried Eureka radar sets and would send out signals to be picked up by the aircraft, bringing in the main body of the 101st Airborne. Frank Lillyman was down on one knee, looking out the jump door and comparing what he saw to aerial photos on the drop zone that he'd memorized before the mission. Like the pilots, he familiarized himself with all of the important landmarks. One of Frank's men got the go-ahead to shuck his reserve, and most of his comrades followed suit. They pushed them under their seats. Ridding themselves of that spare parachute meant one less piece of gear for them. They went through their preparations. At Lilliman's command, snap up. They clipped their static lines to an anchor cable running the length of the aircraft's cabin. Their hurried equipment checks followed in rapid succession, each man inspecting the chute of the man in front of them and yelling out, "Okay." Lilliman's final task before the jump was to go down the line and check his men's static lines. Then he returned to the door to wait. By his watch, it was 12:12 a.m. when the ready light came on. In the troop cabin, Lilliman's men shuffled toward the exit. Lilliman was in pain, having torn leg ligaments in a training jump 4 days earlier. He didn't want to miss D-Day though, and he tried his best to hide that injury. He looked down at the English Channel, a coastline appeared, and then the plane entered thick clouds. They were over enemy territory. Suddenly, Lilliman was looking down at Norman fields and hedgerows and old stone farm buildings passing below in the moonlight. He saw the narrow road heading for Drop Zone A. Lilliman stood up straight and ordered his men to get ready and stand in the door. A green light flashed a few seconds later. Lilliman shouted, "Let's go!" Then he stepped out into the propless, followed by 17 others. The pilot noted at the time that he dived low, heading back towards the English Channel. It was 12:15 on the morning of June 6, 1944, the most important day of the 20th century. The first Americans had arrived in France. Frank Lillyman had drifted down from 450 feet at 16 feet per second with an unlit cigar and clenched teeth, trying to spot a clearing as the earth rushed up to meet him. He landed in a small field near Saint-Germain-de-Varville. He and his men were each carrying over 100 pounds of equipment. The group were under orders to not fire their weapons and were instructed to take evasive action should they be spotted by Germans. After freeing himself of his parachute, Lilliman took off across the field. He thought he could see something moving in the shadows behind some tall poplar trees. He loaded a clip in his Thompson submachine gun. Here's what he said. "When I landed, I noticed over in a shadowed portion of a field a moving mass, and I thought it was a large enemy patrol. I couldn't figure out why they didn't open fire on me." He went on with his story. "I started loading my Tommy gun, and I was sure that the noise could be heard all the way back to England. I was all set to cut loose when the mass let out a very blatant moo, and I certainly felt rather foolish." The shapes were cows, and he laughed to himself, and he felt a little bit nervous. Some men replied with their crickets, and within minutes, Lilliman connected with 7 of his group. Silently, they examined maps and scouted the immediate vicinity in pairs. Lilliman soon realized he had dropped more than a mile north of where he should be, but there was no time to get to the planned positions for setting up the lights. For 47 minutes, those 18 men were the only Allied forces at Normandy. Lilliman later explained, "They were the longest 47 minutes of my life." Within less than 30 minutes before the main body of aircraft would arrive, Lilliman decided to use the nearest suitable fields. Lilliman could make out a church less than 100 yards away at the center of the town, and soon he and his men had gathered in its graveyard. The church steeple would be an excellent spot for a Eureka setup. A priest came to the heavy wooden door at the main entrance. He looked afraid. One of Lilliman's men, a young lieutenant, could speak French. "Bonsoir, Padre," he said. "You've been liberated." lieutenant explained what we were doing, and a Eureka set was soon in the steeple, as well as 3 others along a hedgerow near the church. The pathfinders laid out lights forming the T 200 yards to the east of the church in a field beside a narrow lane. Then 2 men climbed a tree and put another Eureka set in the branches. He remembered being told by a scout at around 12:30 in the morning that there was a farmhouse occupied by Germans close to a 22mm anti-aircraft gun position that could wreak considerable havoc when the sky train of Screaming Eagles began to arrive over Drop Zone A, which he and his men had marked with lights and the Eureka homing sets. Frank remembered 2 others and myself went to the house where we met a Frenchman smoking a pipe. He was standing in the doorway. He jerked his thumb upward and said, "Boche." We caught 1 German in a nice pair of white pajamas in bed. We disposed of him and expropriated the bottle of champagne beside the bed. After several hours, we were sure that only 1 farmhouse about a mile from the church near a lane bordering a small field with a gate in view of the kitchen window was the first occupied building liberated by the 101st Airborne Division around 12:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944. Lilliman made his way back to the church and waited anxiously for the sounds of the engines. Time passed slowly, making for what we called the longest minutes of his life. At 12:40 in the morning, he finally heard it, the steady drone of hundreds of planes to the north, and ordered his men to turn on the drop zone's lights. Frank later said those lights never looked so bright in training, but that night they looked like searchlights. 1 light went out and we had to rig an emergency connection. We were silhouetted against it for a few minutes. The first aircraft flew over the T that Lilliman's men had placed on the ground. It was 12:57 in the morning. The main body of American airborne troops had arrived in Normandy. The Pathfinders didn't meet any other Germans before the main body of paratroopers began to land, although 1 enemy bicycle patrol did approach before turning around. They wanted no part of us, nor we of them, I guess, said Lilliman. With the paratroopers safely down, he took his group on a 7-mile hike to Heisville to prepare a field for a second group of gliders to land. They got 18 Nazis on the route, Frank recalled. Those jokers were standing behind hedges and their guns were covering the roads. We didn't use the roads, but sneaked up behind them and potted them from the rear. We didn't lose a man. They assisted in getting the next batch of gliders down. Then they were spotted by the Germans. A 50 caliber machine gun started firing at them through some bushes. Lilliman took cover as the Germans, hidden in the hedgerow, fired several more bursts. Frank would later say, "Damned annoying it was. Finally I sent 2 men to convince him of the error of his ways. Pretty soon I heard a grenade go off, and then everything was lovely and quiet." Under heavy enemy fire, Lilliman led his men in defense of the drop zone and provided cover for the follow-up waves of Allied forces. Near a village called Heisville, south of the morning's position and still inland of Utah Beach, Lilliman located a field that had been cleared of defensive obstacles and was large enough to fit the next group of gliders. As he and his men positioned Eureka sets, lights, and pots exuding green smoke that would guide the horse of pilots, German troops infiltrated into the neighboring fields. The horse of gliders crossed Utah Beach, cut loose from their tow planes, and aimed for Lilliman's landing zone. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Lilliman took his men to locate a glider that had landed by itself just a short distance away. The Germans opened fire as the gliders were landing. Some pilots panicked and crashed into trees. Lilliman was running toward a smashed glider to help men get out when a bullet hit his arm. Someone shouted his name. He looked at his sleeve and saw blood flowing. Then he collapsed as a piece of mortar shrapnel sliced his face. We engaged the enemy and some joker got me in the arm with a machine pistol, he said. As I fell, I got a mortar splinter in my face. A medic treated him and he was taken to an aid station and after that evacuated to a hospital in England. His wounds were not life-threatening, but for Captain Frank Lillyman, D-Day was finally over. Lilliman, though, wasn't prepared to wait on what he regarded as the wrong side of the English Channel. A few days later, the captain went absent without permission from the hospital, determined to rejoin his men in Normandy. He wrangled his way back into a supply ship on June 14th and reported for duty back in France. In a letter dated June 9th, Frank wrote to a friend, "I didn't like the idea of staying in a hospital, so I found some clothes in a supply room and shoved off. I forgot to tell anyone where I was going or what my intentions were, but after 2 days, I ended up back here in France." News footage of the 101st Airborne in Normandy showed an ever-cocky Lilliman right after the Battle of Arlington, recognizing Frank as the first American to land in France on D-Day, Thompson submachine gun in hand, nonchalantly answering questions.
This is Captain Frank L. Lillyman of Syracuse, New York, of the Pathfinder Section, 502nd Parachute Infantry. Captain Lillyman was the first man to set foot on France during the invasion. Is that right, sir?
I jumped to #1 position in the leading aircraft that night.
That should have made you #1 man, then.
Yes, it should have.
I understand that you were wounded that night, sir. How did that happen?
Got a little foolish, but the main events that night is still rather hazy to me.
I imagine you got into some rather tight places, didn't you, Captain?
I'll say we did. There's one in particular. Got shot that night I got shut up. I'd still be out there in the field if it hadn't been for Wilhelm here and Park. Those two refused to get out of there until they got me off that field where I was exposed to enemy fire.
We understand that you were sent to a hospital back in England. How does it happen that we find you here today?
Officially, I can't answer that.
Unofficially, would you say?
I came back to be with my outfit.
And a fine outfit to come back to.
Best soldiers in the division.
What do you think is the way your men have acquitted themselves thus far, Captain?
This regiment helped to make history in that Battle of Arlington. You've probably read about the Battle of the Four Bridges on the roads leading into Arlington.
I'm quite sure that you're proud of them, sir.
No question of it. They acquitted themselves honorably.
Good. Congratulations to you and to them.
His desertion from the medical base was apparently overlooked by his superiors because shortly thereafter he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Maxwell Taylor, the commanding general of the 101st, was apparently not at all happy to see his wayward, now famous Pathfinder. According to one report, he waved the papers for promotion under Lilliman's nose and then ripped them up. A few weeks later, Lilliman paid the price for going AWOL and was ordered to change units, moving to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion. His days as a swashbuckling Pathfinder were over. The 3rd Battalion was the right unit for someone eager to see action. He and his fellow Screaming Eagles in the 502nd Parachute Infantry were in the thick of it at Operation Market Garden. "This war is a funny game," Lilliman wrote home after D-Day. "We've had a lot of work, considerable fun, some losses, lots of laughs, learned a million things, and gained lots of experience. This next one should be a Lulu." By the end of that bitterly cold January 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground and the Battle of the Bulge came to an end. As the winter snows began to melt and spring came, the Allied armored units rolled toward the banks of Germany's swollen Rhine River. It was the last major obstacle on the road to Berlin.